All right, so I completed the Ridetech 4-link install on a first-gen Camaro. It's sitting under its own weight, and it was challenging. It's really not that hard of a thing to install. What I struggled with was really getting the pinion angle set and the rear end migrating back and forth while trying to do that. And I think once you figure out how to do that and stop that from occurring, I built wheel cribs. And total disclaimer here that if you do that, you build those at your own risk. I'm not telling you how to build those. They do make life easier in some cases. I have a lift, which also, you would think that's best case scenario, and I kind of did things in order to try to make things easy on myself. That being said, it was still challenging. Putting the cradle in, I did another video on that, and not many people have watched it, so refer to that at your own risk as well. But the only things I did differently than what's stated in the instructions is I didn't put a couple of rev nuts in, but I did state that I was going to weld the cradle in place, which I did. So follow all the manufacturer's instructions if you, for your own safety. So the things I ran into really with this was what I stated was when I set the pinion angle, you set all your arms at the appropriate lengths, and I used 2 jigs on the upper bars. I ended up getting another jig because you don't really want to weld on the R joints obviously for heat reasons, and then they can articulate, and so they wouldn't necessarily fall flat right in the spot where you want it to land. And once you get your ride height adjusted, so I built struts out of angle iron at the appropriate ride height at 14.5 inches. The holes were apart. That takes time to do. You have to kind of clearance them in the top so they can pivot a little bit. And then really was trying to get equidistance between the inner wheel well and the back side of the tire on the car. Your outer measurement to the outside wheel well or the outer quarter panel doesn't necessarily, that distance doesn't necessarily correspond to how much clearance you'll have on the inside. Mine did not. It was not a 1-to-1 ratio. There's definitely bias on this side. I had way more clearance on the driver's side. And so I needed to shift my rear end over slightly. Not so much that it's going to, drastically affect handling, but enough to, at least give me clearance and bump that it's not going to rub. And then if there, alignment issues or something like that, the adjustable bar lengths the upper bars, you can move the rear end back and forth. So there's still adjustment in there, but, I figured set it up with maximum clearance, as square as possible, and, measure everything out ad nauseum, really. I mean, it took me forever, it seemed like, and I was by myself. So, but what I ended up figuring out was, I built these cribs. Like I said, do that at your own risk. And, they say do everything at ride height. Well, with the length of the shocks being the appropriate length, or the struts that I made, without the upper bars connected, as soon as you start putting weight on the axle, it's gonna climb. And that makes sense, right? So you can't really put full weight on the axle and do it at ride height because it doesn't quite work that way. But, with a lift, I had the advantage of changing that. So I ended up playing with the height of the car via the lift. And, there's weight on the front cribs, but it didn't seem like it was sitting there at ride height, and I was kind of struggling with that too. But eventually I figured out how to set the pinion by just altering how much weight's on the back tires, via the lift. And once I got it really close at about 3 degrees and shimmed appropriately, and I ended up shimming my rear end on the back side of the wheel well to the tire, using wood and, you know, like a metal plate. And got that squared, you know, distance between the front of the tire and the quarter. And that's dictated by the, you know, by the horizontal bars on the bottom. So that shouldn't vary much, but these cars have a lot of variance. They're not square. They're built with, you know, old jigs and gas welded, and, you know, they were never meant to be around 60 years later with a 4-link suspension and 3-inch exhaust and, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, not a surprise there that, you know, there was quite a bit of variance in the build quality. They're not a bad car, but, you know, they had their limitations for sure. And the biggest one, in my opinion, was leaf springs. I didn't really like the leaf spring suspension. I mean, it did its job and it was cheap, but yeah, this should be a much, definitely a superior setup. So I guess take home message, you know, think about that. You can probably alter your pinion angle by just ride height and, you know, set your bars, and then tack them in. And that worked pretty well. What else? One thing I will note, or you should take note of, is that these brackets in the photos, in the instructions, because this is the newest iteration of and you can see those horizontal bars up there that run basically right over the pumpkin, or, you know, pumpkin kind of bisects those. You know, they run like this and this. So this was the newest version, and basically there is no bracket that sits above the back seat, and then, you know, sandwiches between it, and then with bolts. It's all anchored on the cradle itself, on the frame rails. So you basically get it in there and get it all squared up, and there, you know, I kind of discussed that in my first video. Like I said, no one's probably going to watch that, but anyhow, if you do that, it's pretty straightforward. That part's not that hard. But the new instructions have pictures from the previous generation. Since this is really the 3rd generation, you know, there was the G bar and the air bar and those type of things. And then they changed the orientation of these upper links from this to this on the latest one. And then with mine, they added those horizontal bars that were run longitudinal, I should say. And that differed, but the instructions actually show pictures of these bars in 2 different orientations, and it shows the bracketry. And I kind of struggled with that because I knew it, you know, obviously it can only go this direction, but they both point in. That's pretty straightforward, but it was like, what about the orientation of the brackets themselves? How far do they hang over? Are they in the same plane? And I had one of my brackets backwards initially. I didn't tack it or anything. I was really hesitant to do that because it just didn't seem right, because the backbone should go on flat. And then finally I found the exploded view. There was a drawing of the whole suspension system in the front page of the newest instructions. So use the newest instructions. Some of the text will tell you to use the old ones. They'll tell you to weld that pipe on there in between the fender weld to maintain ride height. The instructions say use a block. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that didn't seem to work. And then one of the texts said, you know, once you have your shock strut, if you have simulated shocks in there with those struts, you don't need the blocks. And I don't know what the tube's going to do for you other than, you know, be a pain in the ass to weld. But the one thing I would say is don't pay attention necessarily to the way they have. Some of the pictures are incorrect. And I would probably trim the backbone if I was going to do it again, and I would have inset it. In other words, trim the side of it and then inset it, and then welded it flush with the inside of that, and that would have set more flush on the back side of the axle tube, because the brackets kind of hang over a little bit. I mean, I boxed it and welded it and whatever, and it's not beautiful, but it's fine. I mean, I welded the inside of both brackets and obviously the outside of both brackets, and then did the backbone last. It's not going anywhere, I can tell you that. The tacks were really strong. They were strong enough, actually. I did like a couple of tacks that, I was able to put it down on the weight of the vehicle to check, and then check my pinion angle and see if it held, you know, under its own, like completely under its own weight with the bars connected, and it did. You know, and it, you know, changed like a quarter of a degree, half a degree, something like that, 3.3, 3.5. But, you know, and that's not a surprise, and it's totally fine. So anyhow, yeah, this is still 10 minutes long. But if you have a buddy to help you to get the thing square, and he can help you measure, and if you have a lift with cribs, I highly suggest it. If you can get the thing high enough without a lift, you know, I guess you can do it on your back, but it would be, I don't think I could have done it without the lift personally, not by myself. But all right, well, good luck. Thanks.